Hello there, it is Jo from Minerva, and today we are going to have a look at my top tips for sewing lace. Lace isn't a fabric that we choose maybe for everyday sewing, but actually you can make some pretty casual garments in lace. This is the Montrose top by Cashmere, which I've been working on, and I have lined it, but I've left the sleeves sheer. This is an evening dress. This is with a couture Donna lace, which is a cotton lace, and I've used a crepe to line this one. So there's a few techniques to know when you're choosing lace, but it's not as difficult to sew as you might think. Tip number one is how you cut your lace. So take a look at your equipment and check that you're going to get a really good cut. If you've got a lace with a cord running through it, you might find it's a lot more chunky to cut on these thicker areas. So these are my favourite dressmaking scissors. I have one with a ribbon tied around them that I use for thicker fabrics, and I have one that I keep completely for silk, satin, viscose, any drapey fabrics that haven't been through anything thicker. So this pair has been through denim, it's been through Ponte Roma, and I've also cut this lace with them because you can hear I've got quite an uneven and thick amount of fabric to go through where the cording is. Cotton couture lace is also pretty thick. This one has different thicknesses, especially here where it's been really embroidered, and there's quite a depth to it. So make sure you use a pair of scissors that's going to go through your fabric, or you could try a rotary cutter and maybe pop in a new blade. If you've got some fabric with some texture to it, it's also a good idea to cut your lace in a single layer so you can see where the patterns are. If you want to do some pattern balancing and have this row of flowers running down the centre, you'll also be able to check if you've got a border that you're utilising it well. It depends what scissors you've got. You might be able to get through 2 layers. If you're making something casual, you can probably get your fold line and just make sure that it's on that flower run. But if you're cutting pieces for joining together and constructing, you might be better to cut it out on a single layer. So see how you go. Always do a little test piece. Tip number 2 is to have all the right equipment so that you can get the best out of your lace. When you get your machine ready to sew, it's a good idea to put a sharps or a microtex needle, and I take the packet to the side of the machine so I know that that needle is in the machine. So if I switch my next project to a stretch and it's not going very well, I'll know why, because I've got a sharps needle in. I can take it out. If it's fine, I can put it back in the packet. If it's blunt, which if it's a sharps and you've been using it for a whole project, it might be, you can throw it away. You won't really know which needle to use on your lace until you get it and you feel the thickness of it. You see if it's got a stretch, you see how much mesh background there is. So it's always important to do a test piece, checking out your needle in case you need to change it back to a universal, or if you've got one with stretch, to a stretch needle. Number 3 is always, 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 always test your lace, because even these 2 laces had a different setup on the machine. So lace is very different from one fabric choice to another. So you need to make sure that you know your stitch length, you know whether your overlock is going to work with it properly, you want to choose your seam finishes. So all of those things you will do at the test stage of sewing with lace. Number 4 is how we're going to sew lace. This is a non-stretch lace. It's the Chantilly lace that I'm wearing now, and I'm going to do a little test strip to show you. And the tempting thing with lace is that you don't want it to scrunch up your fabric. So you tend to think a longer stitch length won't damage it so much because a shorter stitch length will chew it up. But actually you need quite a short stitch length. If you do a long stitch length, I'll show you what happens. Your lace will ripple and gather up because there's nothing strong enough in those net areas to support those long stitches. So your seam will be all puckered and gathered up. So you need to change your stitch length down to 1.75 or 2. If you've got a dial machine, just keep hovering just below 2 and see what you can get. Have another go. This time I'm going to try a seam with 2 layers together. And it's not puckering, and when I peel the seam open I can pull it and it's not stressing or tearing on those mesh parts. So you need to turn your stitch length down. I've spent lots of time in my videos modelling and telling you to back tack at the beginning and the end of your fabric, but don't do that with lace. If you're starting on quite a meshy part of your fabric, so here you can see it's quite an open weave part, if I try and back tack on there, that fabric will just scoot down inside the feed dogs and it will all get chewed up before I start. So one of the things to do when you sew with lace is to make sure that the foot is on the fabric and you don't back tack at all. At the beginning or the end. Leave some nice long tails and hand knot your seam ends. If they're going to get enclosed into a seam, then you could just tie one knot, but if it's at the end of a dart, then you might just want to do 2 little knots. So don't back tack when you're using lace. I haven't got the option, but if you've got the option to swap your foot plate, or you have a different machine that has a single hole for your needle to go up and down, that's quite useful because you don't have so many holes and areas that the lace can escape down. Number 5 is decide on your best seam finish, and again that will come from the test part of your lace sewing. So make sure you've tested before you start your project how you're going to finish the insides of your lace and what finish would you like when you're wearing the garment. It depends how you're constructing your garment. This Montrose top is made with the lace bit separate to the crepe bit underneath. So there's an element of sort of shadowing here where the seam is slightly disguised by the crepe. So I just sewed my seams together. I did a little test at the beginning on the overlocker and I got a good overlocker finish. So that's one way you can do it. It's quite forgiving lace, so if you haven't got an overlocker, it's absolutely fine to sew on the machine. You can zigzag down that edge. You can do quite a close zigzag so it doesn't chew it up. So remember, if you're zigzagging, it's the same principle as if you are sewing the seam. You need to have quite narrow zigzag so that you're not chewing it up and then you've got a lovely seam and then you pucker it all up with the seam finish. You can also try a French seam, so if you've got quite a delicate lace, something that's or a tulle that's very, very fine, you can do a French seam, so you can check that out on another video. If you've got something that's got beads or sequins, then you're going to have to do a little bit of handwork along your seams, so you'll need to be tying off and sewing the beads that are near the edge, so that if you cut any of the threads, they won't all start coming undone. Another way you can work with lace is if you use lace to make one complete piece of fabric, which is what I did on the green dress here behind me. So rather than trying to make a fabric item and a lace item and try and marry them together, I did lots and lots and lots of hand basting. So I cut out my green crepe pieces, I cut out my lace couture pieces, I put them on top of each other and I hand tacked them all around, and then I just treated it as one piece of fabric. It does make quite thick seams at the back, so you'll need to layer some of those out. Because the top of the dress was lined, then all of those seams were underneath the lining. Number 6 is very specific to using lace fabric. So you will want to know whether you're going to get a border on your lace, and that will be in the descriptions of the fabric on the website. So it sometimes gives you a close-up of the border so that you can have a look. You can also look at a fabric focus video where somebody holds up the fabric and you can compare to the size of your hand how big the border is. The border is really great for finishing sleeve edges or hem edges. I've used the border print on this lace along the sleeve hems and the waist hem, and that was fine because on the Montrose top the sleeve base is on a straight line and so is the hem. The hem's not curved or high or low at the front or back. But if you have a hem that's slightly curved, or a sleeve indeed that's slightly curved, like a petal sleeve, then you might want to utilize the border of your fabric, but you can't, because you can't cut the pattern piece curved. But what you can do is you can take the border off the border piece and sew it onto your curved shape, because then once this is removed from that straight plane, it will have more pliability. So first of all, I'm going to take off the border, and I'm going to look for a motif that matches the edge of what I'm working on. So this large flower is quite a large symbol and motif in this lace work, so I want to keep those. So now I've got a border that's much more pliable. I have got a flower here, so I could sort of cover that over and pin this in place. I could get a steeper curve if I wanted to. Let's go a little bit more. And I can either pin these in place, or you can use a quilter's basting tape, which is essentially a double-sided sticky tape that comes out in the wash. So you can put some tape along the back of your border. Make sure you've got the lace so that both right sides are facing up. You haven't got one wrong side up and one wrong side down. And stick some tape along there. You can sew through it. It's really great. Started using it quite a lot in tricky areas of sewing. But just so that you can see what I'm doing, because it's quite invisible, I'm going to use pins. If I turn that corner there, I'm getting a little kink. So I can snip those threads between the lace motifs and manipulate the shape a little bit more. And now I can use a white zigzag stitch on my machine to go around the edge of the lace. It needs to be quite an open zigzag. You don't want it to look like it's zigzagged on. So you just need to be taking your zigzag through these areas. And this fabric has really big holes, so you definitely need to make sure that you're not pulling two parts of the pattern together. So now we have a curved hem. Could have curved it a bit more, but I was just showing you. I've used a zigzag stitch. You can't see it. And now what I'm going to do is layer out any spare behind the back of the zigzag, because I'm getting a bit of a thick white line. Here I'm getting quite a thick line because I've got a little bit too much fabric behind here. Again, the same as with my large scissors, I have ones with a ribbon on, that means thick fabric. So I can go through these different layers of embroidered cotton. Give that a press, and then you've got a curved edge. It's particularly nice if you want it for a sweetheart neck. So if you want to use a border on a neckline, but you couldn't cut it out of your big piece of fabric, you can manipulate the border and put the border where you want to. If you've got a really fine fabric, this one's really thick, but if you've got a fine chantilly lace or a thinner fabric, then you might want to adjust the presser foot on your machine, because if the pressure between the foot and the foot plate is too big, then the fabric's just scooting through. You might need to add a little bit more pressure, but not damage the fabric. So again, that's at your testing stage. Number 7 is stretch yourself and learn a new technique. So I have been working on learning a lapped technique for cutting my lace and using the motifs to be lapped over the seams. I've not honed it completely yet, but I'm really enjoying the process. Okay, let's imagine that this is the bodice piece of a dress, and this is a princess seam. So this is the side front. So that's the bust shape, and you've got your seam allowance as well. To lap a seam, what you're going to do is do what's called thread tracing, and you want to trace the finished line, so that's the pink line, trace the pink line of the pattern onto your fabric. So I've done it with a red thread. I don't know if you can see it or not, possibly not. I've used a red thread and I've copied that pink line underneath, and I've placed it so that these flowers here on this sort of row here will overlap the next seam. So that will be the seam that comes along the princess. So this piece is the side piece, and then we'll have the centre front piece here, and I want the flowers to overlap. I don't want to see two seams just going in like that and joining. I want to have some of these flowers overlapping the seam. So we thread trace our finished seam line. I'm going to pin the fabric to the pattern piece, and now we're going to cut along the cut edge. So this is our seam line, then we've got a seam allowance, so we're going to cut along here, but we're not going to cut through those flowers. We're going to cut up to them, round them and along, and I'll show you how it works. It's probably better if I just speed along and cut. So can you see what's starting to happen there? We're getting our piece, but on the bust finish is where you would tend to do it. So now I've got this side panel, but I've got these flowers sticking out over the top. My red line is still marking the seam allowance. Because this is called an overlap seam, then we don't pinch our fabric together, right sides together. We now use the thread trace line here, this one's red, and the thread trace line on our bodice piece, so that's just a mock-up of the next piece, and we match them up and overlap them. So we're looking for that red line to match the green line underneath, but we're putting the fabric wrong side on top of right side. That's why it's called overlapped, because the one piece of fabric sits on top and overlaps the other. So you might do this if you're making a wedding dress or a bridesmaid's dress or an evening dress, because then you can distribute and use an optical illusion to add the flowers. Then you do the same as we just did for the hem borders. You zigzag around your flowers, and then you can go back with your scissors and cut out any of the excess. You can also go for a more couture finish, and you could hand sew those down. So that's why you see lace evening dresses and wedding wear with all that lace finish. It's probably all hand sewn down. You can see I'm getting quite a thick line of brown there, so I would go back and trim out this seam as well. You can also cut out individual motifs and hand sew those on. You probably wouldn't need to use a pick stitch or a stab stitch, so rather than sewing them over and over or with a running stitch, you just need to go straight through and bring the needle almost up where you went in, and then move to the next spot, and you do little stab stitches or pick stitches. So that is how you do an overlapped seam. Number 8 is you may need to swap in and out some materials. So if you want to interface a lace but you don't want it to show through, then you might need to use a tulle or a net around a hem, for example. If you want something around you to interface your neck but you don't want it to be scratchy like lace, then you might use an organza or a silk or something that's quite sheer. Remember, you won't be putting iron-on interfacing on lace because you'll get that gluey bit coming through the net parts of the fabric. Number 9 is marking your lace fabric. You can't just use your pencils and your chalks as normal because you might have gaps in the fabric where you want to put a stitch point mark or a notch and there's nothing to draw on. So let's have a look how you can mark lace fabrics. When you're marking lace for construction points, so maybe at the end of a dart or a finish of a zip, your usual traditional marking tools aren't very useful because if you need to mark where there's a huge hole, then there's nothing to mark on. So sort of improvise a little bit. You can use a bit of masking tape. I've got a little bit of washi tape here. So on the back, reverse of the fabric, I'm going to stick a little bit of washi tape so that I can then mark my dart point on the tape. So I'm using the tape as a little piece of sort of temporary paper between the holes in the lace. And then when I've sewn my dart or sewn to that point for pleats or whatever, then I can peel it off. If your lace is a little bit more substantial, you've got some webbing or some netting, then the best thing to use is tailor's tacks, where you pull little threads through and snip them off and mark areas that you need. It's just you can't tailor's tack where there's nothing to tack to. And my top 10 tip, which is number 10, which is to always use a press cloth, because this fabric is cotton, so I still used a press cloth, but a lot of fabrics are a nylon or a polyester, and you will need to be changing down the heat on your iron and using a press cloth so you don't damage your overall garment. I got lots of tips today on how to sew lace in the Simplicity Simply the Best Sewing book, which is absolutely fantastic. It is a real sewing bible with lots and lots of information for buying fabric, altering patterns, techniques for sewing, and this was the chapter that I used today, which is sewing on special fabrics. I hope that's given you some confidence to try a lace fabric. Lace fabrics are huge in range, particularly on the budget point of view. So you can buy a Chantilly lace that's a real budget fabric and you can have a play around with it and you can layer it on top of a lining. You can use most dress and skirt patterns and make your fabric one piece. So if you want to choose a lace for the first time, you can put your lace and your lining fabric, whichever one you choose, together and baste them around the edge and use them as one piece of fabric. That way you're just following the instructions as normal. The other method is where you make two separate items. So this is the lace top, which hangs freely from the lining, and then there will be a place where you join your two pieces together. There might be an element of hand sewing. I've hand sewn the sleeves into the lace, but lace is actually much more forgiving than you think. Do go and explore our lace fabrics. There's glitter ones, sequined ones, cotton ones, polyester ones. There's lots and lots to see. Do head over there. While you're there, you can check out some Minerva Makers lace projects. You can use the hashtag lace, you can use the hashtag bridal, you can use the hashtag evening wear. They all throw up some fantastic lace projects. We would love to see any projects that you've made with lace, beginner or advanced, it really doesn't matter. We love to see photographs. They don't have to be professional, just wherever you are, in the garden, that's fine. We'd love to see what you've made. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.